turns out that Andrew Sharpless and I have more than interest in water in common. I haven't met Andrew yet, but reading through his CV, I came upon the fact that he used to be the vice president of the Museum of Television and Radio in New York City. And some of you may know that I have a museum of television. His museum was about programs. Mine is about artifacts and sets, Andrew. So it's particularly good to meet you. I hope you have time while you're here in Toronto to have a look at my little museum.
I will do that.
Right. But getting back to water, we've dealt with water at this conference quite a few times, primarily through the aegis of the Waterkeeper organization. Bobby Kennedy Jr. has been on this stage a couple of times, and while we've approached it sort of more from a river point of view, we're happy to hear now from your perspective, and the organization is called Oceana.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So sometimes our mindsets make us miss opportunities. We've all had that experience. The conservation movement begins about 100 years ago on the land. And on the land, agriculture is very often opposed to biodiversity. On the land, we cut down the forest, the biodiverse place, to plant the cornfield. And the moral imperative of feeding people is as important as the moral imperative of protecting life. So it can feel like war. And like a war, people commit, full on, one side or the other. When the conservation movement went into the water, in the oceans about 30 or so years ago, took that mindset with it. And that's meant that we've missed a kind of an opportunity, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. And first, let's start with a couple facts. There are a lot of hungry people in the world. There are nearly 1 billion people in the world with, experiencing hunger every day of their lives. A lot of those people live in fishing nations. And in those fishing nations, you have 750 million very, very poor people. This is going to get tougher in the coming 40 years. We're going to be 9 billion people on the planet by 2050, plus or minus 1 billion, depending upon your model. So the task of feeding all of those people is a real challenge for the world. And if we think about doing it just from terrestrial resources, you really see the challenge as very tough. 9 billion people is a 34% increase in the number of people on the planet in 2009. But because increases in standards of living are forecast, the food demand is expected to grow faster, 70%. That means we have to get all parts of the planet engaged in feeding people. If we just look at the land side of the equation, here's some remarkable data. Since 1960, arable land per capita has already been in decline. And the terrestrial agricultural systems of the world are about to face the challenges of climate change. This map shows you in the brown the areas forecast for much less rain, the areas in blue forecast for much more rain. All of you will recognize that the breadbaskets of the world, some of which are in Canada, are headed for drought. So in a situation where we already face an incredibly strong demand for terrestrial food, we are facing disruption. In that situation, you would want the oceans to feed as many people as they can. And this data will show you what the oceans have been doing for people since 1970. It's just the catch of all of the world's fleets added up in tonnage. And that's a pretty picture. That shows steady growth. And in fact, basically as far back as the data will show us, this is what we would see. Steady growth from the world's oceans until about 1988, when the world's catch, just in tonnage, peaked and began to decline. We need to turn that around. We need to make sure that the oceans can play a big role in feeding the planet. Now, how do we do that? Now, a practical person will start by saying, take me to the most productive parts of the ocean, and we'll focus on that component first. And happily, the most productive parts of the ocean tend to be in the shallowest parts, shown in this map. And the very good news for a practical person is that the coastal zones of the ocean, the shallowest parts of the ocean, are managed by the coastal countries that they're next to. They're called EEZs, and they are under national jurisdiction. You don't have to go to the United Nations or to a treaty organization to make decisions about how those parts of the ocean are managed, unlike the high seas shown on this map, which indeed are managed internationally. And as we all know as practical people, international bodies struggle to get things done. Nation states, some of them, are quite capable of doing things. So we now hope that the fish have the good sense to locate themselves in the coastal zones. So let's find out if they have done so. Here's the answer. The world EEZs have, by a ratio of 7-to-1, the marine fish of the world. By a ratio of 7-to-1, the fish have located themselves where we want them to. If we're a practical person hoping to manage the oceans successfully. Now you're ahead of me. You're saying, but wait a minute. There are 100+ coastal nations in the world. If we have to go to all of them and get them to do a better job, we still have a very daunting task. So now you want to know the question of, are the fish concentrated in some countries as opposed to others? I'm going to give you the answer. We made a list at Oceana of the catch of the countries of the world from largest to smallest, and we asked the question, what share of the world's fish catch could we manage successfully if the top 10 countries on that list would do their job? The answer is 53% of the world's fish catch are in the EEZs and caught by the fleets of these countries. How much of the world's fish catch do the top 25 countries manage? 3/4. This is very, very good news. 10 to 25 countries have it within their capacity, have it within their arms to deliver to the future a well-managed ocean and a productive and abundant ocean that is feeding hundreds of millions of people. What do we have to do to get there? 3 things. Fishery management comes down to 3 things. Set and enforce scientific quotas, protect nursery habitat, and reduce bycatch. Bycatch is the accidental killing of non-target species in the process of fishing. Those are the 3 pillars of good fishery management. That's what we have to do. Where do we have to do it? Now, wait a minute. Do we have evidence that this actually works, or is this a theory? I'm going to show you some evidence that will prove to you, to your absolute satisfaction, I am sure, that this will work. But before I get there, I want to quickly address another question you may be wondering. What about fish farming? Can't we farm our way out of this problem? Most of the fish that are farmed, many of the fish that are farmed, are fish that eat fish. Salmon, for example. And if you are farming salmon, you are catching wild fish, grinding them up into little pellets that look like dog food, and feeding them to the farmed salmon. And in the process, you are converting 4 pounds of wild fish into 1 pound of farmed salmon. It's a reduction activity. You are not increasing the number of fish available to people. You're reducing it. If you are farming fish that eat vegetable protein, soybeans, you're not doing such a destructive thing, but in fact, your contribution to the planet is about equal to taking a chicken farm and putting it under the water. You're feeding grain to fish, and so you still need a field somewhere and a farmer producing the grain for you. Back to the data. Do we know how to recover the ocean? Can we get this done? The answer is in the data I'm going to show you now. This is the U.S. haddock population from 1965 till 2007. The United States fleet clobbered it, pushed it down to very, very low levels. Around the middle of the 1990s, the United States government finally got around to putting fishing quotas in place. Guess what happened? Fish came back. Here we have the Norwegian herring population. It gets, from 1950 till 2011, it gets overfished. The Norwegians get around to putting fishing limits on in the 1980s. What happens? Fish come back. Here we have cod, not your dearly beloved Canadian cod, but their Norwegian cousins. Guess what? Also clobbered by overfishing for 30, 40 years. Finally, limits get imposed, fish comes back. This happens all over the world. This is one of the great causes for optimism. Fish are an incredibly resilient and powerful part of the ecosystem. And if you give them a little bit of help, quotas, habitat, and bycatch management, they will come back in a 5 or 10-year period. On a global basis, we can not only get back to the peak that I showed you a little while ago, but we believe good management of the ocean by 10 to 25 countries can take us up to a new peak of fish production which is sustainable forever. 10 to 20 million metric tons of fish more available from the ocean than we've seen in the past. That means, if you converted that into meals, that instead of 450 million people eating a seafood meal every day, which is where we will be in 2050 if trends continue, we can be feeding 700 million people a seafood meal every day, forever. And if we were willing to stop feeding fish to animals and other fish, that could be 1.1 billion people eating seafood every day. Now, this is all good if you're just a hungry person who wants to eat fish. It's also good in terms of its role in the overall management of the planet. Fisheries are the most cost-effective animal protein strictly from a businessman's perspective. This compares fish produced per $100,000 compared to poultry, pork, beef, and other livestock production. Fish is, guess what, not a consumer of land. Land in short supply is not pressed by the production of fish. Guess what? Fresh water, another very short resource in certain parts of the world, used a very small amount in processing, not required in wild fish production. Interestingly, not a source of climate-forcing gas. Methane produced in enormous amounts by livestock production, on terrestrial livestock production. Climate-forcing gas, not true of fish. So if you care about any of these other things, you want this to happen. If you like eating fish, you want this to happen. And by the way, if you're talking to your doctor, and we just saw one here on stage a moment ago, he or she will be telling you that you ought to be eating fish. Because if you shift from red meat to fish, you will see in the medical literature major reductions in heart disease, cancer, and obesity. Fish is very helpful directly and indirectly. Here's another way it's indirectly. Should you care only about an abundant ocean if you like to eat fish, or you care about water, or, you know what? I think you should care about this if you eat food. And if you're one of those people out there who eats food, listen to me now. Because this is the data from the IMF on the core price of food in the world, and we are going through a spike period for the last 10 years. And if you allow the oceans to collapse, then you are going to substitute for that source of animal protein a whole lot of cattle, and those cattle will be eating grain. And that will be a source of additional pressure on the price of the core price of food in the world. So making the oceans productive is good for everybody. Now, I said at the beginning that conservationists, when they went into the ocean, they took their mindset with them from the land. And that meant that they focused on protecting biodiversity. That meant that they focused on going to those places in the world represented by the two top parts of this 2x2 quadrant. Imagine the countries of the world classified into these quadrants based on whether they are high biodiversity, high production, low production of fish. And the conservation community focused on the countries on the top because the conservation community felt like its job was to protect biodiversity. In the ocean, the most biodiverse places tend to be hot, reefy places. The most productive places tend to be cold water places. Oh, I don't know, Canada, Alaska. So there is the opportunity. If you care about optimizing ocean production, you need to spend more attention and time on managing the fisheries in the most productive parts of the world, which a recent study shows we are not doing. We have invested a lot in biodiversity protection, which is good. And now we need to pay additional attention to the most productive parts of the world's fishery, of the world's oceans. And when we do that, we will do what the conservationists want. Because the things that we do to make sure the oceans are productive are the very same things that will make the ecosystem abundant. Habitat protection, quota enforcement, and bycatch reduction will make a strong ecosystem and a productive ecosystem. Oceana does this by running policy campaigns. I'm going to rapidly show you how we do that. We set a policy objective, usually quota, habitat, and bycatch. We figure out who can get that done, and we press them to get there. That model has delivered 50 policy victories in the last 10 years since we've been founded. I'm not going to tell you about all of them. 3 of them would be examples where we set the goal in Alaska of strictly restricting salmon bycatch in the pollock fishery. We got that done. We set the goal in Belize of protecting them from bottom trawling. That's a form of fishing where you drag heavily weighted nets along the bottom, clear-cutting the bottom. We got that done. There is now no bottom trawling anywhere in the EEZ of Belize. And in Chile, where they were overfishing and wrecking the jack mackerel fishery, one of the 3 most important fisheries there, by just driving down the spawning stock, we set the goal of getting sensible scientific limits on jack mackerel. We got that done. This is something that proves that people can, acting together in the 10 to 25 countries around the world, do what we need to do to make the oceans play a really important role in feeding the planet. And I want to end by just saying that I don't think it's an overstatement to say that fish is the perfect protein. It's the healthiest thing you can eat as an animal protein. It's the least damaging to the fundamental fabric of the world's natural systems on these dimensions we've talked about. It's the most cost-effective. And it's the one where the war that we talked about at the beginning, the war between agriculture and biodiversity, a war between 2 morally very compelling objectives, feeding people and protecting life, is not occurring. The goals of those 2 objectives are allied. The former enemies are now allies. We can do the same things that we need to do to make the ocean abundant, and that will make it productive, and we can feed lots of people. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.